I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin a while back, and sometimes people who kind of forget their chronology of history will ask me, how come Benjamin Franklin was never elected president? And my short answer is, well, he died. And in fact, he died before, well, he was still alive barely during the presidential election of 1789. So conceivably he could have run against George Washington, but nobody was running against George Washington. But that's not the real reason he wasn't. He never became president of the United States, because he simply didn't have the personality to be president of the United States. He was a brilliant leader of a sort. He was a brilliant leader of the persuasive kind, but not the, what should we call, get out in front and lead from that position kind. He wasn't a George Washington. He was a great committee man. He could take 50 people on a committee or in a parliament and figure out what they needed, what they wanted, and write up this in the form of a bill or a resolution in a manner that everybody could sign on to and then get it forward. He had a brilliant way of getting people to agree with him, of signing on for the measures, the initiatives he thought ought to be undertaken, even without, especially without, taking credit for himself. He managed to allow people to think that his bright ideas were actually their bright ideas. And it was a kind of behind-the-scenes leadership. This was exceedingly effective, but it didn't carry over into the elective political realm. Well, he actually was what was called President of Pennsylvania in the time when the separate states, their chiefs of state were all called presidents rather than governors. But it was an honorary position. He didn't have to run for it or anything like that. So anyway, I guess what you need to do is figure out where your talents lie, what your temperament is like, and then find the field where you can succeed. And if you're Michael Jordan, decide whether you want to play basketball or play baseball. Anyway, I'll stop there. Now I will take questions if anybody has questions. Yeah, please.
Is there a quality of leadership that is important no matter what sector you're in, that you need that particular quality?
Yeah, there definitely is. And this is where history comes in. It's not just history, but this kind of a sensitivity to others. What you need is the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes and in other people's minds and see how the world looks from their perspective. You don't have to accept their perspective, but you do have to try to figure out what they're looking for. Because leaders, by definition, have to deal with other people. You can be brilliant in any particular area of endeavor, but if it's just you, well, then you're not leading anything. So leaders have to know how to get along with other people. They don't necessarily have to make people like them. In the history of the American presidency, there are some presidents who take the model of they want everybody to like them. And they succeed, some of them succeed that way. There are other presidents, I would argue, if we wanted to get into an argument over this, I would argue that it's more common for successful presidents to make enemies as much as they make friends. Because the only way you make changes in any system is to figure out how to whack the system over the head and knock it sideways. You know, if you want everybody to like you, if you want everybody to get along together, what you're saying is the status quo is fine, because the status quo has a lot of inertia and it really resists change. And the only way you can really change the status quo is to figure out who's with you and who's against you. And if you look at presidents from Thomas Jefferson, who really, you know, in his inaugural address, he said, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans," but he was lying through his teeth. He knew perfectly well that he was still going to target the Federalists, these bad guys who were trying to undermine American democracy. Andrew Jackson was famous for the enemies he made. He's the only president ever to have killed a man in cold blood, in a duel. Now, he didn't conduct any duels when he was in the White House, but he did the next best thing. He found his enemies. He waged what amounted to a political duel against Nicholas Biddle, and he won. Abraham Lincoln. Talk about driving people apart. Well, you know, it was his election that split the Union. Theodore Roosevelt knew how to make enemies. He targeted J.P. Morgan and what Roosevelt called the criminal rich. Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. He castigated the money changers of Wall Street, and he was constantly berating the wealthy who put their own self-interest above the interest of the nation. And for his pains, Roosevelt was called a traitor to his class. And he reveled in that description. In fact, I stole the description, the phrase, as the title for my book about Franklin Roosevelt. So if you're going to make changes, you have to know how to not just bring people together, but split them apart. Other questions? Brian, did you have a question?
Yeah, but it's backtracking a little bit.
Okay.
It's related.
All right, well, Mike, or either way.
Two of the people that Hank and I interviewed for our Vanderbilt project mentioned what a pity it is that we don't allow our leaders to change their mind. And using Vandenberg is a prime example of someone who did change his mind. And contemporary politicians, if they change their mind, they're looked upon as a flip-flopper or whatever. Can you talk about the value of being able to change your mind as a good value in leadership?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary to be able to change your mind, because nobody's perfect, nobody gets it right all the time, and very often situations call for action even before you're absolutely sure what the appropriate action is. And here I'll draw on the example of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt became president in March 1933 when the nation's economy, particularly its financial system, was in absolute crisis. And Roosevelt declared what he called a banking holiday. This is a federal edict that all banks are going to be closed for 5 days. This was to stanch a run on the banks. And in his inaugural address and in his early messages to Congress and the American people, he said quite frankly, we're going to try this solution. We'll hope it works. We'll do our best to see that it works. If it doesn't work, though, we are not going to be too proud to admit that it's not working and try something else. That's very rare in a president, because presidents sit at this pinnacle of power, but it's a very vulnerable pinnacle. When you're at the top, you might be very powerful by virtue of being at the top, but you're also very exposed. And if you acknowledge weakness in any aspect of what you do, then you simply invite other people to take pot shots at you. Roosevelt was able to get away with this, in part because of the nature of his personality. He had, and personality is absolutely crucial to leadership. He had a very secure sense of himself. And I'm a little bit surprised, even now, when I look at political figures, political leaders, who almost all the ones who get to the highest level are very talented people. But many of them are also very insecure. They can be very thin-skinned, and they just don't like criticism. And so this is one reason why presidents, for example, are often reluctant to acknowledge mistakes, because it damages their own self-image. But also because we ask so much of presidents, we want them to be perfect. And for them to acknowledge that they're not perfect somehow diminishes them in our view. Roosevelt was able to get away with it, in part because he had this very secure image of himself. And he could say, okay, didn't work, so we'll try something else. And he didn't then have to say, boy, maybe I'm not qualified to be president as a result of this. But the other thing was, the nation was clearly in crisis. And the American people were willing to go along with whatever a president tried. And if it didn't work, okay, then let him try again. It's not often that the country is in crisis. It's a good thing, but it's one of the quirks of American political history, that great presidents come along not during times of peace and prosperity, but during moments of crisis. And this is not to say that the people who preside during peace and prosperity aren't potentially great presidents, but the fact is, if the nation is prosperous and the world is at peace, you don't need a great president. All you need is somebody to just keep a steady hand at the till and just keep her going in the same direction. The great presidents are the ones who change course, and they have to know when to change course, what direction to change course to, and how to accomplish the turn. So if you decide you want to be president, and you want to be a really great president, wait until the country is in crisis. Then come along, and then you have a chance to be considered great. Theodore Roosevelt always knew that he would never be considered a great president because the country was peaceful and prosperous while he was in the White House. He is considered by historians of political science a good president, a near great president, but not a great president. And he was a victim in this regard of his own success.